I lost my wife on a Wednesday. Not the way you're thinking. She was standing right there in the kitchen, pouring her morning tea, very much alive. What I lost was the version of her I had spent 31 years believing in. And the strange thing is, I didn't even know she was gone until a surgeon was standing over me telling my family I might not make it through the night. Welcome to Home Voices. Pull up a chair, make yourself comfortable, and know this. The people in these stories had every opportunity to do right by the ones who loved them most. They made their choices, and so did I. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. You won't regret it. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, recently retired after 28 years as a structural engineer with a firm based in Brisbane. I drove a silver Land Cruiser that had more kilometers on it than I care to admit. I made the best slow-cooked lamb shoulder in our street, and I coached junior rugby league for 11 seasons until my knees told me, very firmly, that those days were behind me. By every measure that ever mattered to me, work ethic, loyalty, showing up, I was a good man, living a good life. Or so I thought. It was a Wednesday morning in late April when my colleague and oldest friend, a man named Phil Cartwright, found me slumped in the passenger seat of my own car, in the car park of the Bunnings at Strathpine. We'd gone together to pick up some timber for the deck I'd been meaning to build for 3 years. Phil said I had just gone quiet mid-sentence, which he admitted was so unlike me that he noticed it immediately. He said I'd been talking about treated pine versus hardwood, and then I simply stopped, like someone had switched me off. Phil called the ambulance. Then, he called my wife, Diane. I don't remember the car park. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I remember a brief and very strange sensation of weightlessness. The kind you get in the first second of a roller coaster drop, except it didn't stop. No pain, no noise, just a kind of immense and absolute quiet. And then a voice, sharp and no nonsense, cutting through everything. I thought, yes, I can hear you perfectly well. I just can't seem to find where I've put my body. When I came around properly, I was in the ICU at the Royal Brisbane. I had tubes in my arm, a monitor clipping at my finger, and a nurse named Margaret who had the calm efficiency of someone who had seen absolutely everything and was startled by precisely none of it. "Good afternoon," she said, not looking up from the chart. "You've decided to rejoin us. How long?" I managed. "You've been with us since yesterday morning. It's Thursday now." She looked up then, and her expression was carefully arranged into something professional and reassuring. "You had a major cardiac event, Mr. Whitmore. You coded once in the ambulance and once in theater. Dr. Okafor brought you back both times." I stared at the ceiling for a moment. The tiles had a small water stain in the corner, shaped vaguely like Tasmania. I remember thinking that was either a good omen or a very bad one. I looked around the room. There was a bunch of yellow flowers on the windowsill. I would find out later Phil had sent them, because, of course, he had. There was a get well card propped against the water jug with a drawing of a deck on the front, which made me laugh internally and then wince from the effort. There was an untouched cup of tea gone cold on the bedside table, and there was an empty chair. I asked Margaret where my wife was. She did something careful with her face, a very small, very controlled adjustment, the kind that trained professionals use when they're about to say something they'd rather not. "She's been notified," Margaret said. "She rang this morning to check in." Rang. Not visited. Rang. She rang. I repeated. "Yes. She was told you were stable." Margaret straightened the blanket across my legs with the focused attention of someone who needed a reason to look somewhere other than at me. "I'll let Dr. Okafor know you're awake." That was the first crack. Hairline thin. The kind you only notice when the light hits it at the right angle. After 31 years in the same house with the same woman, you'd think I would have seen it coming. I didn't. I had been too busy being the person who showed up to notice that she had quietly, incrementally, stopped doing the same. Dr. Okafor came to see me that afternoon. She was a compact, direct woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the brisk manner of someone who had important things to do and was going to tell you exactly what you needed to hear, regardless of whether you were ready. She explained what had happened in clear, specific terms. A significant blockage. Emergency intervention. I was to have absolutely no stress, no heavy lifting, and no rushing back to anything for at least 6 weeks. Your wife mentioned you had plans, she said, setting her clipboard on the bed rail. Did she? A cruise, something departing from Sydney. She asked whether the timing was going to be an issue. I lay there and let that settle. We had booked the cruise 8 months ago, 2 weeks, Sydney to Auckland, for our 32nd anniversary. It was Diane's idea. I had been the one to find the deal, to manage the booking, to arrange for the neighbors to water the garden while we were away. Diane had been the one to grow increasingly vague about the details whenever I brought it up, which I had attributed to her being busy with her book club and her walking group and her various other pursuits. When does it depart? I asked. She said 11 days. 11 days. I was lying in an ICU, having coded twice, and my wife had called, not visited, and asked whether the cruise was still on. I'll call her, I said. She'll come. Dr. Okafor looked at me with an expression I filed away without fully reading. It was only later, much later, that I understood what it actually was. It was the look of a woman who had heard that sentence, or one very like it, more times than she cared to count. Phil came to see me that evening, carrying a paper bag that smelled like a meat pie from the bakery near his house, and wearing the expression of a man who had spent the better part of the day feeling guilty about something. He sat down, handed me the pie because hospital food was, in his words, an insult to the concept of eating, and for a while we just talked. The Broncos form, a bloke from our old firm who'd just been made redundant. Whether I was still going to build the deck or hire someone to do it properly. The comfortable, aimless conversation of two men who've known each other long enough not to need a subject. And then, the way winter comes in Queensland, not gradually but all at once, his face changed. Has Diane been in? He asked. She's coming, I said. She's sorting some things out. Phil nodded. Slowly. The specific nod of a man who doesn't believe you but respects you too much to say so out loud. Phil. Yeah, what do you know? He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. A long moment passed. The monitor beside me beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Nothing, mate, he said. Phil Cartwright is the most honest man I know in almost every other area of his life. He cannot play poker to save himself. He once accidentally told his wife about her own surprise birthday party because, he told me sheepishly afterward, he felt bad keeping it from her. The man was carrying something right now that was too heavy for his face to hide. I could see it plainly, but I was tired, and I was weak, and some part of me, the part that had spent 3 decades being very good at not asking questions I didn't want answered, let it go. Diane rang that evening. Her voice was warm and concerned and pitched at exactly the right frequency for a worried wife who had somewhere important to be. Gerald. Love, I've been so worried, she said. How are you feeling? Is the food terrible? Are they looking after you? I coded twice. Diane. A pause. Brief. Professionally managed. I know. And I feel awful that I haven't been able to get in. It's been a lot to organize from here. Organize what? Come to the hospital. It's just the cruise, Gerald. We depart in 11 days, and there are still things to sort out. The travel insurance is complicated, and I've been on the phone all afternoon trying to understand the policy. Diane. I said her name. The way you say someone's name when you need them to understand that the version of this conversation where they talk their way out of it doesn't exist. I nearly died. But you didn't. Her voice shifted. Something underneath the warmth. Something harder and more practical. You're stable now. You have doctors. You have nurses. Dr. Okafor said you were out of immediate danger. I want my wife here, and I will be there, I promise. The second we get back, silence. Who are you going with? I asked. On the cruise. What do you mean? We booked it together. I know we booked it together. I'm asking if you're still planning to go. Without me. A pause. Longer this time. Carefully calibrated. Gerald. The cancellation policy is, who are you going with, Diane? My sister and a couple of the girls from the walking group. Margaret thought it would be a shame to let the booking go to waste, and I thought, with you needing rest, it might actually be easier if… Go, I said. Silence. Go on the cruise, I said again quietly. Enjoy it, Gerald. Good night, Diane. I hung up and lay there in the hum and beep of machines that had, against reasonable odds, kept me breathing, and something settled in my chest. Not anger, anger would come later, briefly, and I would deal with it and let it go. What settled in me now was something much quieter and much more permanent. It was clarity, the particular, merciless clarity of a man who has just had every piece of comfortable self-deception stripped away from him at once and can finally see the room as it actually is. She left on the Saturday. I know this because Phil let it slip, the way he always let things slip when he was uncomfortable. Too much information offered as a distraction. He mentioned the traffic would be bad on the gateway because of some business down near the airport on the weekend. I know it because Margaret came in to do my vitals on Saturday afternoon and gently asked whether I had family coming by later, and something about the way she asked it told me she already knew the answer. And I know it because I called the house twice that afternoon and got nothing but the answering machine and the sound of a life that had been running parallel to mine for longer than I had understood. I spent 9 days in that hospital room getting physically stronger, while something else was quietly, irrevocably rearranging itself inside me. The surgeon had brought me back from the edge of something I had no business coming back from. What she couldn't have known, what I didn't fully know yet myself, was that the man who came back was not entirely the same man who had gone under. I was quieter now, more deliberate. I found myself listening to the nurses when they talked about their days, actually listening, not the performative half-attention I had perfected over decades of being busy and important and going somewhere. I lay in that bed, and I thought about 31 years of a marriage I had believed in, absolutely. And I started to understand, with the terrible calm of a man with nowhere else to be, how long I had been believing in a story that hadn't been true for quite some time. My daughter, Kira, came to visit on the 3rd day. She drove up from the Gold Coast, walked in with her partner and a container of my slow-cooked lamb that she'd made from my own recipe. Sat down, took my hand, and cried without saying anything for about 2 minutes. Then she dried her eyes and asked what I needed, and I told her I needed the lamb and a cup of decent tea. She's 34, my Kira. She has her mother's eyes and, I am grateful to say, none of her mother's capacity for convenient absence. Kira did not ask about Diane. I noticed that. I filed it away. They came back on a Sunday. I was home by then, discharged after 9 days with strict instructions, a bag of medications, and Margaret's parting words, which were, "Don't do anything stupid, and eat properly." I had arranged for Phil to pick me up because there was no one else to ask. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard the car in the driveway. I had a cup of tea in front of me and the newspaper open to the crossword, and I sat very still and listened to the sound of suitcase wheels on the front path, the key in the lock, the door opening, and voices, 2 of them. Diane came in first. She was tanned and relaxed in the particular way of someone who has spent a fortnight at sea, laughing at something over her shoulder. And then a man I had never seen in my kitchen stepped through my front door behind her, and he was carrying, in addition to his own luggage, one of Diane's bags as though this were a perfectly natural thing to be doing. His name, I would come to find out, was Warren Tish. He was 58, divorced 2 years prior, and had apparently been part of Diane's walking group for the better part of 18 months. He worked in property development on the Sunshine Coast and had, I was told later by Phil, who had clearly known more than he'd let on for quite some time, the kind of easy, uncomplicated confidence that comes from having never had to fight very hard for anything. They hadn't looked toward the kitchen yet. Warren saw me first. His hand, mid-reach to set down Diane's bag, went completely still. I took a slow sip of my tea. "Welcome home," I said pleasantly. Diane's laugh died before it finished. She turned and saw me, and went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, guilt, calculation. And then, with a composure I had to genuinely respect in the way you respect a thing that impresses you against your better judgment, something approaching normalcy. "Gerald," she said. "You're up." "I am," I said. "I've been up since 6. Made a pot of tea. It's probably gone cold by now, but I can put the kettle on." I looked at the man standing in my hallway. "Warren, isn't it?" From the walking group. I nodded toward the chair across from me. "Sit down, both of you. I think we should have a conversation that is long overdue." Diane opened her mouth. Whatever she was going to say, she thought better of it. Warren put Diane's bag down with the careful movements of a man who has just realized he is in a situation considerably more serious than the one he thought he was walking into. They sat. I reached into the folder on the table beside my teacup. I had put it there that morning, precisely where I wanted it, the way you set a table before guests arrive. "Diane," I said, and my voice was completely level, because the man who had come home from that hospital had burned through every variation of the conversation he might have had here and arrived, weeks before this moment, at the only version that was clean and true and worth having. "I want you to understand something before I say anything else. I'm not angry. I mean that. I'm past angry. What I am is clear. Completely. Finally. Clear. And I want to talk to you clearly. Maybe for the first time in a long time." I slid the folder across the table. "Those are divorce papers," I said. "Filed 3 weeks ago. My solicitor is a woman named Ruth Ng. She's been managing the process. Everything is legal. Everything is documented. And I want you to know that I engaged Ruth specifically because she told me her approach was thorough and fair. I'm not interested in punishing you, Diane. I am interested in doing this correctly." Diane looked down at the papers. The color left her face, the way light leaves a room when someone draws the curtains. I had, in the weeks I'd spent recovering, done a number of things. I want to be clear that every single one of them was done legally, with Ruth's guidance, reviewed 3 times before anything was signed or transferred or filed. I had moved our shared savings into a managed trust. Not all of it that would have been both legally and personally unconscionable, and Ruth had been very clear on the proper boundaries. But the bulk of our joint investments, property holdings in my name, and the superannuation I had been building for 28 years were now structured in a way that was airtight, documented, and correct. Diane would receive her full legal entitlement, and nothing would be hidden or manipulated. But what had been mine, unambiguously mine, by virtue of 31 years of 12-hour days and working through school holidays and missing things I should not have missed, that was no longer at risk. I had spoken to Kira, not to enlist her against her mother, because that was not the kind of father I had ever been, and it was not going to be the kind of divorced father I was going to become either. But because Kira deserved honesty, and because she had sat beside my hospital bed and held my hand and cried, and she had not once asked where her mother was, that told me she already knew more than I had. I had also, and this one still makes me quietly proud, written a very measured and professionally worded letter to the property development firm where Warren Tish was a senior partner, a firm which, by a coincidence I had discovered during a conversation with an old colleague, had tendered twice in the past 18 months for projects through my former employer, projects on whose preliminary assessment committees I had served. Ruth had reviewed the letter. It noted a perceived conflict of interest given Mr. Tish's personal relationship with the spouse of a former committee member, and suggested the firm may wish to review its disclosure policies going forward. Warren had not known that I knew this. The expression on his face when I slid him his own copy of that letter was, and I say this with the equanimity of a man who has lived long enough to appreciate irony, absolutely worth the 9 days I had spent alone in that hospital room. There is a version of this moment where I had performed, where I had let my voice shake with the weight of it, or let the grief show on my face, or given Diane the satisfaction of knowing how much of me she had taken with her without realizing it. I had decided, somewhere in that ICU room with the Tasmanian water stain on the ceiling tile, that I was not going to perform. Not for her, not for Warren, not for anyone. Diane said eventually, "Gerald, how long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. "Why didn't you say something?" I considered this question carefully. I had been considering it for weeks. "Because I wanted to be sure," I said. "And because I needed to be well enough to have this conversation properly. And because, Diane and I want you to hear this, I didn't want to say something I would regret. I've worked very hard in my life to be a man who doesn't do things in anger." She was quiet for a long time. Warren had not spoken since sitting down. I suspected he was beginning to understand that there was no version of this conversation that benefited him, and that the wisest thing he could do was exactly what he was doing. "The house," Diane said finally, "is in my name. Has been since we purchased it." Ruth reminded me of that. I smiled without warmth. Helpful woman, Ruth. The account is being managed through the settlement process. You'll be properly looked after. That was always going to be the case. I told Ruth from the beginning that my goal was not to punish. It was to be accurate. There's a difference. I looked at her steadily. You'll need a solicitor. I'd suggest getting on to that quickly. What happened next surprised me, and I have thought about it often since. Diane did not get angry. She did not try to argue the facts, or question the papers, or test the edges of the situation she was in. Instead, something in her face changed, the way weather changes over the bay, not dramatically but completely, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in a very long time. It was shame. Clean, unadorned shame. The kind that doesn't come from getting caught, but from finally having to look at the shape of the thing you've done. "I'm sorry, Gerald," she said, quietly, without framing, without context, without any of the qualifications people use when they're apologizing for the performance of it, rather than the substance. Just, "I'm sorry." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I believe it was true. I also believe, because the man who came home from that hospital had developed a very clear eye for the distinction, that it was the kind of sorrow that comes when a future you had assumed would always be there stops being available. Whether she was sorry for what she had done, or sorry for what she was now going to lose, I couldn't tell you. I'm not sure she could either. Warren left first. He shook my hand at the door, which I thought took a certain kind of guts, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, "I am sorry, for what it's worth." I told him it was noted. He collected his bag and walked back down the front path, and that was the last time I saw him. Diane stayed another hour. We talked, really talked. In a way, I think we had both stopped knowing how to do somewhere around the 15th year of our marriage. She told me things about how she had felt during those years, the loneliness she had swallowed instead of naming, The way she had stopped believing I would hear her even if she tried. I told her things too, about all the nights I had come home and found her gone somewhere I hadn't been told about, and smiled and made dinner and told myself it was fine because I was a man who didn't make a fuss. About how I had spent so many years being so profoundly reliable that I had forgotten, somewhere along the way, to check whether the person I was being reliable for was still there. It was the most truthful conversation we had ever had. It happened 31 years too late, and it was also the last one we would ever have as husband and wife. She left at 4:30. I stood at the front window and watched the taxi pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner towards Samford Road. Then I stood there for another minute, in the quiet of the house that had always officially been mine, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the extraordinary lightness of a man who is no longer holding something too heavy to put down. I called Phil. "I need you to come over," I said. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," I said. "Bring something to eat." "Not a pie. Something proper." He arrived 40 minutes later with Thai from the place near his house, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to hear that something has gone right and still can't quite believe he's been given permission to be relieved about it. We sat at the kitchen table, the same chairs, and I told him everything, every step, every decision, every document. The look on Warren's face when I slid the letter across the table, the conversation with Diane, all of it. Phil listened without interrupting. Which I want to tell you is genuinely not a thing Phil Cartwright is capable of under normal circumstances. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the kitchen ceiling for a long, exhaling moment. "Gerald," he said finally, "yeah, you are the quietest, most frightening man I have ever met in my life." I laughed. A real one. The full, unguarded, chest-deep kind that I had not had available to me for a very long time. The same chest that had stopped in a Bunnings car park in April and decided, against medical probability, to keep going. It felt extraordinary. It felt like the first clean breath of a man who has just walked out of a room full of smoke he had stopped noticing. Let me tell you where things stand now. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. Ruth was thorough and fair and professional throughout. Diane was properly provided for, which is what I had always said would be the case, and which I stand by without reservation, because the goal was never punishment. It was accuracy. There is a difference, and it matters. I sold the family home and bought a smaller place out on the northern end of the Sunshine Coast. Not flash. 2 bedrooms, a decent shed, a back deck that I built myself this time from scratch hardwood, because I went back to that Bunnings and stood in the timber aisle for a long time and made my decision carefully. Kira drives up most Sundays now. She brings her partner and they eat whatever I've managed to produce, and we sit on the deck I built and watch the light change over the hills to the west. She did not ask me much about how things had unfolded with her mother. She had understood enough, I think, from the years that preceded it. What she asked me, the first time she sat on that new deck, was whether I was all right. I told her yes, and I meant it. Dr. Okafor cleared me for full activity at my 5-month checkup. She shook my hand at the end of the appointment and looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You look considerably better than the man I had on my table in April." "I feel it," I told her. "More than I expected to." Margaret, my nurse, passed me in the corridor on the way out. She looked me up and down with the careful assessment of a woman who has spent her career watching people either heal or not heal, and who understands the difference at a glance. "How are we going, Mr. Whitmore?" she said. I smiled. "The kind that goes all the way up." "Margaret," I said, "I am going extremely well. They say that when you come close to dying, you're supposed to find religion or take up painting or suddenly want to see the world. I didn't do any of those things. What I found was considerably simpler and, I think, more useful. I found that I had absolutely no interest left in maintaining appearances. None whatsoever. In being what other people needed me to be, at the cost of being what I actually was. I found that the people who showed up, Phil with his pies, Kira with her lamb and her tears, Margaret with her unsentimental competence, were the inventory of what my life actually contained that was real and worth keeping. And I found that a man of 63 who builds his own deck, cooks his own meals, and sits in the evening watching the light change over the hills is not a man who has lost something. He is a man who has finally found the right size for his life. Let me leave you with something I've thought about a great deal since that April morning in a Bunnings car park. We talk a lot about loyalty as though it were a feeling. It's the repeated, daily choice to show up for the person you committed to, especially on the days when it costs you something, especially when there's somewhere more comfortable to be. Feelings change. Feelings are weather, but practice is a structure. And a structure either holds or it doesn't. And you usually find out which one it is at the worst possible moment. I also want to say this. If you are the person in the hospital bed, or the person who has been taken for granted, or the person sitting at the kitchen table wondering how things got to where they are, I want you to know that clarity is not the same as certainty. You don't have to have all the answers to start making decisions that are honest. You just have to be willing to see the room as it actually is, rather than the room you wish it were. That is harder than it sounds. It is also, in the long run, the only thing that works. I died on a Wednesday. Well, nearly. And the man who came back from it, who built himself a deck on the Sunshine Coast and laughs properly now, and means it, he turned out to be the best version of me I had ever managed to produce. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Welcome to Home Voices. We'll see you next time.